What exactly is a disability? Sometimes it's very apparent, but a lot of times it's not. It's not always visible. Sometimes people will sit down and say, well, I have a disability and it's this, and it really isn't a disability because of the fact it's mild comparison to other people's disability, which could be almost an effort just to move or get up in the morning. It just depends what it is. But let's go through and see what the technical definition is of disability. It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life functions. That probably is the gist of all the different disabilities. Is it a major life function that's impaired, an actual disability? It could be a mental impairment, it could be a physical impairment, whatever it is that really impairs somebody's ability to operate what would be a normal life activity. If it impairs a major part of that, then you might have an issue and you might call it a disability. Does it limit one or more major life activities? It could be cancer remission even. Sometimes that's not even visible, but it could be very painful in the process. Cancer remission, hopefully, is just a temporary state, but during that temporary state, they may well qualify for disability. It could be that it's an actual or perceived impairment that's not both transitory and minor, but could be perceived on top of that as well. Sometimes the employer may decide that this is the disability and make some accommodations for it, even though it doesn't affect a major life activity. By impairment, this is what we mean. So number one, it's a major life activity. By impairment, any physiological disorder or condition affecting one or more of the following body systems. And then we have an entire list of them, from neurological, musculoskeletal, special sense organs, respiratory, including speech organs, cardiovascular, reproductive, digestive, genitourinary, hemic and lymphatics, skin, and endocrine. So, by the time you're all done, toss in mental or psychological disorder. That's a lot of different life's major activities. They're all considered to be an impairment. To some extent, though, it's about the degree that it really is out there. Special sense organs. If somebody has a hard time smelling things, okay, do they have some kind of accommodation that you have to have? If somebody has a hearing loss, can that be overcome with a hearing aid? There's other aspects here that really need to be paid attention to, and what are the actual accommodations for the impairments it could be. Here we have a school board of Nassau County versus Arline. If you look as to what happened, Arline had a recurring case of tuberculosis. As you know, tuberculosis is a contagious disease. Normally, in the past, we've always had people that work in the teaching profession. They would have to get every 3 years a tuberculosis skin test to see if they had it. In this case, Arline had it. She didn't have it. She would have it, and so they terminated her employment based upon her reoccurring tuberculosis. And she appealed it to the courts, and in the court system, they found eventually that she was employable, and they had to work around her tuberculosis, whichever methodology they had to make an accommodation for that. So if it's being regarded as an impairment, somebody who's not disabled legally under ADA, they could be perceived by the employer as being disabled. And so and that could be just the employer's mistake, and there is no defense if they've already allowed that and they don't keep it going. If regarded as disabled is the basis of discrimination, the claimant doesn't need to prove the existence of the disability because the perception all by itself is a discriminatory action. If you view that somebody limps and that they have a major disability and so on without having them check or even having the dialogue, which we'll talk about later on, then don't make an assumption they're disabled, so therefore they can't do this activity. No, you can't have this job over here because we know that you limp all the time because of, well, I have this, and no, that's not going to impair that. I'm doing absolutely fine. No, you can't have it. Then all of a sudden now you have some type of discrimination happening because you're perceiving they had a disability without having an interactive dialogue, which we'll cover in a little bit. So associational disability, sometimes they fear the employee can contract a disability or be genetically predisposed to it, which we had with genetic testing to see if women had the breast cancer gene. they weren't hiring them because insurance wouldn't cover them. That is illegal here as well as underneath the Genetic Testing Act, but also the fact that it's going to increase the overall cost. For example, medical benefits. So that's also another aspect of what disability really isn't. So paying attention or punishing somebody because of what could be is actually illegal because of the fact you're discriminating based upon a disability. Don't assume that performance will be impaired until you sit down and start paying attention to what is it and having that dialogue in the process. Does it impair major life activities? Here's a list of some of the basic major life activities. Can they care for oneself, perform manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and working? It's a shopping list of a whole series of different things, and here's a list. And you can use this as a list because it really is codified. But the reality of it comes down to, does it include bodily functions part of their major life activities in the process? So, and it just depends what it could be. You have a couple cases of temporary aspects of the Summers versus Ultram case. You have that one, but then you also have aspects of like depression. Depression is treatable with the appropriate drugs, legal drugs, okay? Carpal tunnel syndrome with minor surgery, HIV positive status, as long as it doesn't affect anybody else, irritable bowel syndrome, and a back injury. All those are impairments that were added later on to ADA coverage. And you can also pretty much identify that from a common sense basis. Migraines can qualify depending upon proof of the different effect. I get a migraine every time you walk into my office and talk to me. I get a headache. That probably doesn't count. But having a migraine that is almost debilitating, because some migraines are, you may have to sit down and consider that as a temporary or maybe a permanent disability in the process and try to make an accommodation for that. So major life activities, getting along with others, no. Rude people, no. Rude people need to behave nicer. Interacting with others, it just depends if that is a major life activity in an awful lot of jobs. If you have a hard time, that could be a disability. Is it substantially limiting? Okay, it's not trivial, but really the Supreme Court ruled that Toyota in the case below that individual must have an impairment that prevents or severely restricts the individual from doing activities that are central importance to most people's lives. And so if you have that, then you might have an issue over there. You might have multiple impairments altogether that could restrict life activity. It just depends. Is it temporary? Is it permanent? And is it a substantial limitation that relates to life itself and not to the workplace? So pay attention to this case as well as all the other ones we're talking about today about disability. Is it really at the core of this is major life activities? You also have a shopping list of different aspects limiting in their slides as well. What else would elimination by having a disability fundamentally alter the job? If somebody is blind and they can't see, there are some activities they will not be able to do. If somebody is deaf and they cannot hear, there are some work activities they may not be able to do. Some jobs they can. It just depends what it is. The employer may not consider the possibility of the applicant being disabled. It just depends where they are in that moment of time. If the applicant employee is qualified at the time of the adverse employment action is taken, then you may be liable for that, even if it was temporary or a misclassification or a temporary job. Pay attention to what are the essential functions of the position. These should actually have been sought out and put into the job description prior to hiring the person. If your job description isn't current and you don't have what are the functions of it, then you have a problem. If it's moving freight from one building to the next and involves picking up a 20-pound box of paper, putting it on a trolley, taking it to a van, picking it off the trolley, putting it in a van, and the person can't pick up 20 pounds, you've really blundered in the aspect of the job description or the testing function. And do you have a right to have that for a job interview? Can you have somebody load a box of paper on a hand truck and then move it to a vehicle and unload it? Yes, that is a content validity as part of the job. If they can't do that, you have a legal right not to hire that person because that is essential to the work itself. So a direct threat. If it relates to disease, determination it should be based upon the following factors: the nature of the risk, how it's transmitted. Okay, if it's a matter of if it's a lung issue, okay, can you sit down and put a paper mask, and would that actually strain the viruses on the inside of the person coming outside? How long will the carrier be infectious? Severity risk, the probability that disease can be transmitted. You have different aspects of it. If somebody has COVID, what is the window for COVID? And by the way, most masks don't really work on COVID except a level 5 mask. So pay attention to what is the nature of the risk and what is the nature of the job. Level of risk they pose to others. Individualized consideration. You need to consider that person as an individual. Don't make blanket statements that nobody will ever do this over here because you simply don't know. Autism. It depends. Can somebody with an autistic personality that has a hard time communicating emotionally with other people, but they can do this other part over here, quite frankly, they can do extraordinarily well in some other types of jobs. Pay attention to what that individual consideration is and don't automatically classify somebody that's a potential employee out because of the fact that they have something that would limit them in the workplace, but they might be fabulous in another. HIV, AIDS, the immune system compromised, that's a major life activity, but there are also ways, can the person come into work and can they do that? PTSD, it depends the type and how it's affected and what are the triggers to it. Hepatitis C, diabetes, episodic conditions like epilepsy. Just epilepsy, it just depends on the level and can it be kept under control and do they feel it coming on and what are the symptoms when it comes on. One time I had somebody working as a custodian and he had major seizures. And one time, by the time it was done, he had a seizure in a restroom and it was a disaster when he was striking his head repeatedly against the walls and so on. It was not a pretty scene. And by the time it was done, he retired in the process because he simply had too many episodic episodes that were dangerous to him especially, but also to others in the workplace. And he really couldn't do the work anymore because of that, plus also a visual condition. So it depends on what you have to do in the process. See if they can work, see what the ability to work with them in the process is. Look as to, does it limit one or more major life activities? And are the essential functions we're talking about, are you going to have a dialogue with them? We'll talk about the interaction in just a little bit, but have you been able to talk about the job and what has to be done to accommodate them, seeing that they can work through their limitations on it? Because sometimes the limitation is over here and the job could be over here in the process. Take care.